A little while ago, you were talking about certain tendencies within writings on the peasantry, which think of it as the historical agent of change in the contemporary world that will solve problems of hunger and of environmental destruction. And obviously one literature that comes very much to mind within that is the food regimes literature, with which you've also had a long engagement. I seem to recall your essays in a book edited by Ben Crow from perhaps the mid-1980s. Can I just have you speak a little bit about your engagement with the food question, particularly in two different ways. One, the issue regarding food as being posed as a new kind of agrarian question, as Philip McMichael and others have done. And secondly, the way in which you might connect it with your earlier comments on petty commodity production, for example.
Okay. I think the first text I was involved in was with a group of comrades at the Open University. It was called The Food Question. It was published by Monthly Review Press. And they were relatively short, popular essays. And in fact, I didn't write about food in my own contribution to that. But there were several contributions which I thought, and indeed before that book came out, I thought were widening the scope of agrarian studies, peasant studies, as we'd understood it perhaps 10 or 15 years earlier. And this was work by Maureen McIntosh on real markets, taking off from Amartya Sen and trying to develop that. It was work by Barbara Harris-White on, of course, an unparalleled body of work, both analytical and empirical, mostly on India, of how markets work in contemporary capitalism, not least markets for food in all the stages from production through to marketing, processing, and so on. And then the third was Harriet Friedman's work. Now, she became very, very important for me and became a good friend from the late 70s. And her work, initially together with Phil McMichael on international food regimes, I think had a tremendous impact for me, because the tradition of the classic agrarian question was very much focused on the countryside, was very much focused on classes in the countryside, was very much focused on land and labour and mechanisms of surplus appropriation and so on. And their work on international food regimes, putting it on a world scale, I thought was opening up a whole and very, very important area, connected area of inquiry. So that partly fed into my sort of comradely critique of Terry Byers' work on agrarian transitions, which was massively important. And it was to do with thinking about what was happening in capitalism beyond the countryside, beyond particular countries, and actually beyond agrarian classes, and how that impacted on agrarian change. So I have been very engaged with the international food regime literature, and all the issues it opened up for us about the production, circulation, distribution, consumption of food on a world scale, on the world scale of capitalism, which Harriet Friedman, Philip McMichael really started from about the 1870s in their periodization, but some of which, of course, can be traced back further. So I think initially I probably had held to a notion of the place of food within that classic agrarian question, that increasing productivity of labour in food production, hence cheaper food, hence lower variable costs for capital in terms of wages. That was the place of food in the classic agrarian question. This is what had preoccupied Marx in part, and of course before Marx also Ricardo and Malthus and so on. So I think opening it up onto a world scale and looking at the very, very diverse sites of production of food, distribution, consumption, and so on, was tremendously important. Then I did write about international food regimes. I provided what I hoped was a critical but constructive account of international food regimes, especially as those are investigated in the writings of Harriet Friedman and Philip McMichael, including their later divergence on certain issues. I mean, Harriet Friedman is very interesting as well as important for me because she is a food activist, and she writes very informatively about food questions, but she is not quite a small farmer populist in the same Chinovian sense we talked about earlier,
Yes.
and in the sense that Philip McMichael has taken up and incorporated in his perspective. Then later on, I was asked to write a skeptical view on food sovereignty literatures, and that was extremely interesting to me because, you know, it always pays to be conjunctural and to look at time and place, when and where food sovereignty ideas proliferated and became, from where they became popular. And it seemed to me that in the case of food sovereignty, there were two places, Canada and California. And that's not to say the ideas aren't of broader purchase, and of course they have been taken up, especially I think in terms of agroecology in people from and or writing about Central America. And very significant work has been done there. But I did balk at the core belief, which is made pretty explicit in a lot of food sovereignty literature, that small-scale farmers using agroecological means were going to solve the food problem on a world scale, and indeed would be the primary agents of a kind of social revolution that would help save the planet, help save us all. And I went into that quite carefully, including looking at what was going on in claims made for empirical accounts of food sovereignty. And sometimes it came back, not inevitably, but sometimes it came back to the question of who are these farmers who are being talked about and who are being championed. They are the vanguard of food sovereignty. So it's quite legitimate then to ask, which some food sovereignty advocates, very passionate advocates, would do and do in fact, well, what then might be ways beyond the current kind of agro-industrial complexes of food production, food processing, food marketing in contemporary capitalism. And I don't have a simple answer for that, except I would say, going back to what you asked about petty commodity production, yes. I would say that I think there is a substantial role for so-called family farmers, petty commodity producers, using more developed means of production, if one dare say that, achieving higher productivity to meet much of the world's food needs. It's interesting that people like Jack Kloppenberg, who has said, and of course is an advocate of food sovereignty, but said, don't let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't throw the scientific advances that have been made and that are possible, don't let's throw those out with everything else, because these are not technologies generated by peasant farmers themselves. So my conception of viable small-scale, could be capitalist farmers, petty commodity producers, using productive forces that are not so environmentally destructive, I would suggest that. But the problem, as I see it with populism, is that it would include, actually or potentially, a minority of the world's current family farmers. The issue was stated extremely well by Phil Woodhouse in a special issue of Journal of Agrarian Change we had on the productive forces. He said it's a matter of the relations between farming technologies, labour productivity in farming, evidently prices that farmers get, which is a very, very major issue, and it was the relation between those things which are really at the heart of this issue.
Well, I mean, my own take on this is that there's a kind of overload of agency on smallholder farmers in the direction, not necessarily of their own choosing. They may or may not be interested in saving the world or feeding the world at a very cheap and ecologically sensitive way. Also, obviously, it's a very strange category. A small farm in India or China is minuscule compared to a small farm in Brazil or many places in Africa. So even analytically as a category, to think of small farmers or smallholders or small-scale agriculturalists as having an agency despite massive differences in landholding, and also the transition time, in the sense that you have a rapid movement away from farms to cities. The percentage of people to be fed who are not themselves directly engaged in agriculture is growing far more rapidly at a time that productivity by farm size and by crop is in a tailspin and is declining very rapidly.